Good afternoon, everyone. Happy Monday. I am so thrilled to be joined soon by Jonathan Juravich, who is our first returning guest. So it's going to be awesome. He is an amazing writer for the Art of Education University, but also is part of our quick series podcast, The Art of SEL with the Art of Education. Now, I have recommended this podcast to so many educators, not just art educators, but teachers, parents. I'm so psyched. So I see that Jonathan has joined the chat, and we will get him in here and start our conversation right away. Welcome him to the chat. And as we're chatting, if you think of anything, go ahead and drop it right into the comments, and we will be sure to add that to our conversation. Hi, Jonathan.
Hi, good afternoon.
Good afternoon. I'm so psyched to talk to you. I was literally listening to your podcast all morning. I was like trying to cram it in because I was like, I need to re-listen to these. So welcome. How's it going?
It's great. I mean, I guess that's part of my shtick, right? It's like, how are you feeling, right?
Well, that's the thing. I was going to ask you, because there's like some definite formulaic stuff happening in your podcast where it's like, what is happening? So first of all, why don't you just introduce yourself, and then we'll talk about how you're feeling, how you're doing. So we
Good.
have somebody in the chat. Again, what's the name of the podcast? It's called The Art of SEL, produced by the Art of Education University. And we'll, of course, give you more links up to that in a little bit. But Jonathan, can you just tell us first, you're an art teacher. Just tell us a little bit about you first.
Okay, cool. Yeah, my name's Jonathan Juravich. My students call me Mr. J. And I am the art teacher at Liberty Tree Elementary School, which is in Powell, Ohio, just north of Columbus. And I guess this year I'll be starting my 17th year of teaching. I was like, what are the numbers? Where am I at? And yeah, I've been writing for the Art of Education University for the digital magazine, but then also have this great limited series podcast. I've had the opportunity to be a part of developing something new and exciting, which has been great.
Yes. Okay, so I cannot speak highly enough of this podcast. It's amazing. I love all the podcasts at the Art of Ed. So we have Art Ed Radio with Tim Bogatz, and then Everyday Art Room with Nick Hahn. And those are both so amazing. And those are weekly podcasts that come out. But Jonathan, yours is like just a quick limited series. So how many episodes are we in for when this is done?
Yeah, there's 8 total episodes.
Okay.
There's an introductory episode that's like, hey, this is what art in SEL is, right? And then there is an episode based on each of the 5 competencies of SEL. And then there's one specifically on empathy that actually was just released today. And then actually next Monday, we'll launch the last episode. Now, of course, you can listen to them at any time.
Of course.
And technically in any order you want to, I suppose. But
you got it all figured out. But yes, I agree. I mean, I'm up to episode 4 right now, and my personal plan is to finish all the episodes and then go back and listen and like take notes. Because right now I'm kind of just taking in all the information, but there's so much good content that I don't want to get bogged down in just like writing this whole time. So we'll talk a little bit about the guests that you've had on and all the amazing things that you've done to start this really important conversation. But can you first tell us now how you always start your podcast? Tell us in one word, how do you feel right now?
Okay, so this is kind of also a cop-out because I'm going to steal a word from one of my guests. But I think in the second episode on self-awareness, there was an art teacher that said they felt buzzy, right?
I love it.
And it was like, it so describes how I'm feeling because it encompasses lots of things. I'm nervous my technology is going to fail while we're doing this. I'm excited because of the opportunity to talk to you about something that I'm passionate about. Like, I've got all of these feelings wrapped into one, so my whole body feels very, like, electrified, right? It's really buzzy.
I love that description. Yes. I feel like for me, it's either, like, buzzy or numb. I'm just, like, I'm in a fog, or I'm, like, fully awake. There's not, I mean, there is like a medium, but I'm just like, or I'm like, oh, I'm good. I'm ready to go. So I totally get it. But as hopefully you will all hear if you've not already listened to the podcast, which if you have, go ahead and drop into the chat if you've heard any of the podcast yet. But if you notice, and if you listen at the beginning, Jonathan always asks his guests, describe how you're feeling in one word right now, which I think is nice because sometimes you just say, hey, how are you? And it's good. And then it's transactional and we're done. But there's always more than that. It's never just good. In fact, almost rarely, right?
Right. And that's the thing is when we have to be open to listening to people once they ask us and asking
Yes.
them follow-up questions. So if you really want to know how someone's doing, ask them and say, how are you? And then
And
right now, like not
yeah,
later today, not like, how were you last night? Like, how are you doing right now?
yes,
And then step back and listen. And if they say good, be like, no, really, how are you?
sure.
And okay, so here's another thing. As teachers, as we're like walking down the hallway in the morning and we see someone, instead of saying like, how are you? As like just this like thing to say, then
Yeah.
just say, if you don't want to know, just say hi. Or like, good morning, right? Like
Yep.
instead
Yep.
of like, how are you? Like, let's leave that for like actual conversations about how we're doing.
Oh,
So yeah.
completely. I was actually, it's a funny story, real quick, because you and I are really good at side tangents. But there was a friend of mine that was saying one of her pet peeves was people who walk by on the street and in passing they say, "Hi, how are ya?" and then they're gone. So it's like they don't even need a response. It's just reflexive. So I
Yes.
totally get that. It's like if you're gonna ask and listen, or don't even do it. Right?
Just don't even do it, right? Yeah, exactly.
Completely. So let's kind of start from the beginning. The new podcast, which is a big part of what we'll talk about today, because it is, of course, huge part of what our next year is going to look like, things we've been focusing on a bunch. But some people in the chat, or we just might need a refresher, can you tell us what SEL is? And then maybe just expand on a little bit about how you've broken that into the podcast episodes with those 5 competencies.
Yeah. So, and I posed this question in the very first episode to two of an art teacher as well as a director of social emotional learning, right? And that's what SEL is. It's one of our great education acronyms for social and emotional learning. And I say like, well, what is it? And it's hard, like it's hard to describe. And it's because the one director, he goes, well, it's everything.
Yeah.
Right. And you're like, what? So essentially, and sometimes I almost trivialize it by saying it's the art of learning how to be a human.
Yeah.
That almost gives it like too big of a statement. It's learning
Right.
about ourselves and who we are, and then also how we engage with other people and
Yes.
how to do all of that responsibly. Because there's ways to learn how to do that irresponsibly, but we're not doing that. So these are ways to engage with other people and to really fully know who we are as individuals as well. So, and it flows through all aspects of education, but, and I propose that like art education, we do it so well because we're able to have these really rich conversations about emotions and feelings and perceptions naturally with our work. So, there is widely accepted, there are 5 core competencies, which are self-awareness, self-management, social awareness, relationship skills, and responsible decision-making. I have to like, right? And so that's the way that I broke up the podcast episodes, is really focusing on each one of those individually, knowing that there's crossover amongst all of them. So,
right.
Yeah.
So I know specifically at my school this past year, as we were learning in person, we did have different SEL like components in our day, which can be kind of tricky because as you know, SEL is not like a class, right?
Right.
It's not like, here, I'm going to learn to care and think about myself and then I'm good. It's not that, right? It's everything. But it is important for us to really take that time to be sort of intentional about focusing on it, right? Otherwise it sort of gets it's not as much in the front of our mind. So I know that you have arranged all of the podcasts according to the competencies and done sort of like an intro, get us excited about how this is going to be easy to incorporate into how you teach, because it's just learning, right? Continuing to learn and be a great educator and be the best person you can be for yourself too. But I'm curious about some of the podcast episodes you're particularly excited about, which, let's be honest, is kind of all of them. But you have had so many amazing guests. Can you just give us like a quick little overhaul or a little like reminder about what some of those guests are and what some of the important takeaways are that they've given you?
Yeah, I mean, just even right off the bat, that first discussion with Matt Barris, who is a director of social emotional learning, he talks about how like this isn't just for school counselors, right? This is for all of us. And in fact, we can't rely on this one school counselor our building might have, or might have to jump between 3 buildings to take care of and support student social emotional well-being, right? This is,
oh my gosh,
this is for all of us, right? So, and another teacher in that same episode, Catherine, she talks about how like it's the very little things she does, even in how she like lines students up at the door. I guess I keep thinking about like as the episodes go, you can kind of feel me relax a little bit too. Because like at the beginning, I'm like, I've never done a podcast. How is this going to go? So, and what I hope to do at the start of each episode is I share a story from my own life that applies to the episode itself. And of course, there's like funny stories, there's emotional stories. There's the one on responsible decision making that's coming up where I break a window. And of course, my mom texts and she goes, I never heard this story.
Oh, whoops.
What happened?
You can't get grounded when you're an adult, right?
I know, right? I was like, Mom, it was in college. Everything's fine. So there's these really unique ways that hopefully we're able to share our personal experiences through each of these podcasts. But or episodes. But I really love also talking with people that I've known for years on this podcast episodes that I learned something new about them. So in the responsible decision-making episode, I talked to my friend Adrian, who I went to grad school with. We've known each other for a really long time. And yet I learned that every day before she got on the bus, her dad would have her recite the golden rule. Oh. And I was like, what? Every day? And she's like, every day. And I was like, whoa. And then you grew up to become this person that believes this at your core? Like,
yeah.
That's amazing.
How influential. How is that not obviously influential for what kind of people and youngsters we're building by modeling this and talking about it and being it for our kids, right?
Yes. I mean, isn't that crazy to just think that every day she got on the bus reciting those lines? So, yeah, some really unique conversations come out of those topics.
I love it.
Sorry, I went on a tangent there.
No, it's fine. I told you we're going to be full of tangents. Absolutely. So one of the things that I want to incorporate into the vocabulary in my classroom and just be a little bit more conversational and intentional with my students is the word awareness, because you use it all the time, and it's both important for us to be aware of how we feel and act and are as people ourselves, right? Because it's social emotional learning, and that's really important, but also how we are with each other. And we can't do that if we're not aware of our surroundings. So can you give us a little bit of a reminder for how you define awareness for your students that feels a little bit more palatable, and then why why that's such a big part of social emotional learning, like the cornerstone?
Yeah. I do. I believe the awareness is like a cornerstone for like all learning, but we can come back to that. So several years ago, we as a school developed this definition, and it's supposed to be very student friendly. It's a noticing of what's going on in and around you so that you can make a choice. And I love it because it is. It's not just about like your surroundings, which it is, but it's also about like how you're feeling. What's going on up here, but then also what's going on in here, right? And then making that choice. Like, okay, I noticed these things. Now what are my actions?
Right.
Because so often, you can notice. And then what? Yeah, right? So, and a lot of that comes up in each episode. It starts with this awareness piece. There's the self-awareness, right? There's social awareness. With self-management, which we get into, you start with being aware and then you make choices. Same thing with our empathy episode. We talk about how like to have empathy, you first have to be aware to be able to make those empathetic steps.
Right.
So yeah, I feel like it's the cornerstone of everything. And we talk about it already in our classrooms. If you think about whenever we have students look at a piece of artwork and be like, so what do you notice here? Like you're already training their awareness to pick up on those beautiful details. Yeah.
And I think too, when we're in the art classroom, like there's so many things we already do, right? We ask for critique, for observation, to be aware. What do you see? What do you notice? But there's a lot that comes so naturally to then just take it a little step further and check in about the student themselves instead of stopping at the artist creating that work, right? Yeah. Especially now, we know there's going to be, more focus on trauma-informed learning, more focus on checking in with our students emotionally and knowing that though it is not entirely our job to cure or be there to solve all the problems of the world, we can partner and collaborate with people, but it needs to be on our mind about how our students are doing and checking in that way. So, and that kind of brings me to my next thought, which is the fact that a lot of art teachers in particular, but teachers in general, need to first educate themselves, right? Because like with anything, we can't, anything, we can't teach what we don't know, right? So can you just give us a little bit more of why you feel it's so important that we start with ourselves and do the work ourselves first, and then how we can kind of incorporate that into our learning and our teaching for best practice?
Yeah, and I think it was described to me during this professional learning that I had a couple years ago, and I've seen it come in like more and more often about like the airplane. I want to be on more airplanes sometime soon. But like when you go on the airplane and they say like they go through the safety spiel and they're like, if you have a child with you, make sure that like if there's a change in cabin pressure, you take care of yourself and then the child next to you, right?
Right.
So that applies so much to social emotional learning. I can't foster these interactions and this learning for my students about social awareness or relationship skills if I myself am not in the right place to be having those discussions as an adult. Right?
Completely.
So in each episode, I purposely pose questions to each of the guests that gets them to talk about students, but then also gets them to talk about the teachers. Like how as an adult can I continue to work on like my own self-awareness, or how as an adult, or why is it even important that I foster an empathetic classroom, but then I'm also being empathetic in my daily life, and how can I do that? So we do that in each and every episode, and sometimes, and what you do is you hear me like have aha moments as an adult. I'll be like, what? I never
Hold on, I'm
thought
taking
of that.
notes.
Yeah, you're right. Each time I'll be like, wait, hold on. So yeah, so it is super important that we as the adults kind of take a step back and are reflective on the opportunities we're providing students, but then also the opportunities that we provide ourselves. In the social awareness episode, I have Makila. She is a director of equity and inclusion and diversity, actually in my school district. And she talks about how like maybe sometimes it's about stepping into spaces that are unfamiliar for us as adults. Because we honestly do that for students a lot. We put them into uncomfortable situations and be like, learn, right? Like, but it's also like important for us to do that for ourselves as well.
And again, I always come back to the awareness, but how could you not be keenly aware of your surroundings if you're uncomfortable, right? Yeah. When you come to your classroom every day, you know the routines, it's like second nature to you, right? So you're aware of what's going on around you. Maybe, the kids get it, but if we're learning outside in a new classroom, something's different, there's a heightened level of awareness that we need to be kind of mindful of. And I think that's a great analogy to remind us that awareness is something that just continues throughout all of our teaching, right? And all of how it works. So Jonathan, I'm sensing, at least myself, I know there's a lot of teachers that we know we're kind of like, sort of like buckle up, strap in for like next year. Like this year was hard. Okay, well this next year will be too, but like in a different way, right? It's always hard, but it can be good too. So I know that SEL is something that a lot of schools, a lot of teachers are like, give me content, like give me what I need to know. And it's so important that our administration obviously supports that. So can you tell us just a little bit about what you plan to do or what your district does to help support students, and maybe just give a few of the teachers and parents and people out there ideas for how they can both educate themselves, but then advocate for that professional development?
Yeah, I am super grateful that I am in a school that values this, and we always have, but I got pushback at one point. Whenever we were talking about social emotional learning and started using that terminology, it was almost like people were like, oh, not one more thing. Like, how can we add one more thing? And I was like, no, this is what we have always done so well. And so what we've done is actually talk to different teachers within the building about like, what does SEL look like in the context of like fourth grade math? And it does perseverance, right?
Oh yeah.
So
for also for art teachers in fourth grade math, come on.
Yes. Oh, and that is one of my favorite. We'll come back to that. Math teachers. Oh no, I'll
I'll
just
make
say
a
it now.
note.
Okay, so math teachers, bring it up. Okay, so yeah, having those discussions about like how is this relevant to everything that we're teaching? How is this like? What does it look like within different spaces? And having those conversations. Also, I'm in a school district where our professional learning for a whole year was on self-regulation strategies. And then last year it was on how do we foster a sense of belonging. So
Mm,
like for your district to say like, hey, we care so much about this that we're going to have intentional discussions quarterly about like, how do we create environments that have a sense of belonging, but then how do we also fit into that? Like, do we
yeah.
feel a sense of belonging here? So it can be as simple as talking to, I mean, this isn't simple. I said simple, but it's not simple.
Right,
But like
right.
talking to your administrator, talking to people within your curriculum departments about like, where is the focus of the learning going? I
Yep.
know that there's a lot of districts that I've heard from that are going to do the next year, the no new initiative. Do you know,
Yep.
like, right? So they're not going to
Yep.
start something new, but this isn't new. This is important, right?
Right.
So,
Exactly. And
um, yeah,
no, I completely agree. And I think that's kind of what the conversation is too. And I think a good place to start, first of all, like we kind of like backed it up before, talked about before, is educating yourself so that you know in your little community and your space with your students, you can bring them a sense of calm and understanding and at least sort of like infusing that more so intentionally into your own teaching and learning. But also that like there's, you know, as with anything that we need, we do need to advocate for ourselves and for our teaching. And hopefully there aren't so many initiatives coming next year. But as you talked about, it's not one new thing, it's the thing.
yeah.
This
And
is
just
human interaction.
the thing that I think that anyone out there needs to do is do a little research on if your state has SEL standards in place.
Mm-hmm.
Many states do. Most of them are based off of the CASEL
Yep.
standards. CASEL is the one that the Collaborative for Academic, Social, and Emotional Learning.
Yep.
They are like the leaders in SEL, but most state standards are based off of their work. So go find out if there already are standards. When you look at them, and this is what I love about the last episode, a little like heads up, is that a teacher I talked to, she says like, look, this is how seamlessly I can go from the national visual art standards to the SEL standards, and I see the connections. And she's like, oh yeah? And how about we sprinkle in some studio habits of mind? And oh yeah? How about we elements of art? Bam! And it's like she's making this mixed media art piece like in front of you, right?
I love
But it's
it.
true, because if you go look up those standards and you go to your principal, your administrator, someone in curriculum and say, how are we addressing these? Like that is a great first
Yeah.
step,
Oh yeah.
right? Is to say like,
Yes.
hey, these are out there. They're important for us to be doing. How should we begin this conversation with the other teachers in our building? And it's a great place for you to start too, especially art educators. Again, looking at them. Once you look at them, it's not one more thing. It's like literally helps make the connections between what you want to do and what you need to do. So
Completely. And I think too that there's going to be a big push and focus on SEL for the beginning of next year, and
yeah,
kind of like as we're maybe we're not right inside the classroom thinking about it right now. We're in July or June or whatever, so we're not right into it now. But I think it's important to know when we backtrack and think, what are we going to focus on in the beginning of the school year? Do we not always say relationships, making
yeah,
meaningful connections, building routine? Like all of those things are directly related through the lens of SEL, which is probably not very different from how you're likely doing it as an educator anyways. But you're
exactly.
kind of just give yourself a second to step back and say, hey, instead of just doing a name game and we introduce ourselves, let's take it just a little step further. Let's teach them how they can, say a mantra or something, right?
Yeah,
To give that introduction to this is important to us in our classroom to our students, right?
yeah. Oh
So
my gosh.
Jonathan,
Yeah, go
tell
ahead.
me, tell me
I was
now.
gonna tell you. Okay, I'm gonna tell you. So, in the last episode, I talked with Katie Porcho, who is from Indiana, and she talks about this installation that is like mind blowing. It
So
is so
excited.
beautiful, and I know that I am going to start that at the beginning of my school year. And it is about talking to kids about disappointment and hope. And how hope, and this was like, again, we often say like, we hope, meaning like we're being super positive about it. But
right.
in realizing hope, there is also this notion that what we're hoping for won't actually happen.
Yeah.
Ooh. And she is a art teacher for preschool through second graders.
Okay.
Yep.
And
yeah, right. And she talks about these conversations she has with these kids and this art making experience that came out of it, and it is breathtaking. But I don't want to tell you too much because I want you to listen.
Okay. I mean, I'll listen. I already told you I would, but the rest of us will as well.
Yeah, it's so good. But again, it's having these conversations that like we almost need to have as adults too.
Yes.
Like I need to have conversations with people about things that I hope for and also disappointment in my life. But she frames it in such a beautiful way. So check that out.
I'm so looking forward to it. I think it's going to be good. And I think, you know, I was lucky enough to meet with a small group of the Art of Education team about things like this, the content that we're bringing everybody and kind of like what we need to focus on to help make art teachers successful and teachers in general. And a lot of what we were talking about too was like, how are we going to sort of pick up the pieces and build something from something that felt so traumatic and so isolating? And a lot of that comes from like realizing, oh, okay, I feel this way. How can I support my staff first, right? Like we start here and then we go a little bit here to our staff and then we go a little bit here to our students and we keep building that bubble outside until all of a sudden we're collectively just, it comes naturally, right? In the responses that we have and in the things that we feel.
And I would say that something that's brought up throughout many of the conversations is the importance of communication.
Yes.
Because you need to communicate what's happening in your art room outward. So, because if we're having these really important conversations with kids, we also need to make sure that the other adults in their life are clued into it. So if you do that through social media, if you do that through a parent email, if you do that to, like if you're an elementary teacher and you do that through the classroom teacher saying, hey, in your weekly email, can you make sure that families know we're talking about this? Because then that bridges the connection to home and they can have similar conversations at home about what's going on. Yeah.
Because we know we can build the most beautiful environment, a loving, caring space for our students in the art room, but how often are they there, right?
Yeah.
And as much as that's important, the majority of their time is spent with other, grown-ups around them. And it's so useful to connect in any type of way and give them the language as well so that the kids can either be the teachers or so that the grown-ups can consume that information and be kind of in the know of what they need and what they can expect from your students. That's a great reminder as well.
Yeah.
So, okay, so moving forward a little bit, like I just mentioned just briefly before, and hopefully we'll have a few more upcoming conversations on Instagram Live here, as well as some other amazing podcasts. I know Tim Bogatz has some things in the work, and some other people kind of talking about how we're expecting to deal with the trauma of our students. And I know that feels negative, that feels so heavy, that feels like it can be a daunting task, which it can be. But can you just tell us what you're kind of expecting to do as an educator to deal with those needs of your students right when you get to school, or just like what are you expecting and what advice do you have for us there?
I think the first thing is to really know your community, because it's really, I was having this conversation with another educator friend about how every school community is very different.
Yes.
Some schools, my daughter, she was hybrid the entire year. So she would spend some days at school, some days at home. So her world was very different than my students who started out hybrid and then were there every day.
Yeah.
The realities of like how you're living your life within your community, what the rules are within different families, like that is all so different depending on where you live, the family structures that you have, their expectations. And so really getting to know the families and the community is bizarrely important. It can also, as you used the word before, can feel amazingly daunting.
Yes.
But it's important to recognize that that each school community is going to go through some things very different. Again, some teachers are going to want to talk about the past year forever, and some are going to want to say, that's a book I want to put on the shelf and we really need to move forward. And we have to realize that even as us as teachers are going to be facilitating and dancing between all of these different experiences. So I think that, and I'll give you a little bit more information, but I definitely am going to lean on the art installation that Katie Porchot shared in that last episode about talking about seeds of hope, right? And using our previous experiences to kind of water and wash over our seeds of hope to grow something new and beautiful.
Beautiful.
Right?
I'm reading between the lines. I'm reading between the lines.
Yeah. So, because it is important that we acknowledge and are aware of what's happened. And in many cases, it could be creating drawings of memories that have happened. Becoming, in the case of what Katie did, is she created raindrops, right? And having those raindrops have on them images and text from the kids that talk about things that were frustrating. Because guess what? Moving forward, there's going to continually be disappointing, frustrating things in our lives. I mean, we just went through a collective experience, right? So in many ways, huge collective trauma. So in a way, we're able to frame future frustrations and disappointment in this collective experience that we've had. Yeah. Oh my goodness.
I mean, you're welcome to keep going, but I honestly think that's a really great place to start too. It feels doable to say, okay, let's just have a conversation. Let's have a conversation with trusted staff, with people who know our students, who know our demographics, because you and I can talk all day about what we want to do, but when it comes down to it in person, you have different kids than I do, and you have a different school situation than I do. You have, you know what I mean? It's very specific to where you are and who your students are, what they need, and meeting them there. So I think it's going to be really important for us to set a precedent with our staff that this is the expectation, is that we're going to be here to support each other first, to you know, kind of like let's team up, let's bundle up, and let's see what we can do together, and then that kind of just trickles down, just like the rain, to help serve our students in the best way possible. I'm so excited to see what this project is, Jonathan.
Oh, and what you said two things that sparked something in my mind. One is about staff. Anything that I do that's collaborative, like big whole school collaborative, I also invite the staff into it as well.
Yes.
So in something that you do that is talking about our collective trauma, our collective experiences, the school community moving forward, invite the rest of the staff in. Now, some people are going to, like kindergarten teacher Mindy Skinner, she's going to come running down the hallway and she's going to want to be a part of it, right? She's going to be like, I'm here for it. Other people might be a little bit more hesitant or don't want to, and they're adults and they can make that decision. Of course. Always inviting them in. And something else that I think is almost like a general rule that I learned a couple years ago, because we sometimes learn things the hard way, right? Is everyone's summer has also been different.
Yes.
And so when we use terminology with kids, like talking about summer vacations, like some families have saved up all of their airline miles and they're traveling to beautiful places. And then other families are still within their space waiting, right? And so I think that we have to be careful about also the terminology of like a great summer vacation, but talking about like memories from the summer, I think are something that totally, like that is an even playing field, because everyone will have experiences from the summer. Now from those, you might get really challenging ones and you might get really like bubbly, beachy ones too, which are okay. Are okay.
Yes, we welcome any and all experiences, and that's the whole point. Absolutely. Okay, that's a really good point too, is thinking about that vocabulary and how we're just having that conversation with our students too. And I also know, even back before in the beginning of our conversation, you said like, how do we have those discussions with our students? And always when I think of a discussion, I think of like, okay, we're gonna sit down and we're gonna talk for 30 minutes about X, Y, Z, and let's get into it. But it's not that. It's just like, how do you approach something? How do you welcome? How do you dismiss? How do you like talk one-on-one with that student? Like, how are we doing today? You know? And it's that kind of interaction that's what SEL is, right? It's
Oh,
that.
yeah.
It's the
And
everyday.
think about while kids are working, all they do is talk. When
Oh my
actually
gosh.
when they're quiet, you're like, is everybody okay? If I acknowledge it, will I mess it up? Right? Because I do. Every time I acknowledge it, then they're really loud. But
Oh
like
yeah.
it's oftentimes in those conversations that are happening within the room while they're working as well. Conversations you have one-on-one with kids, but then also the conversations that you talk over while they're working, if
Yes.
that makes sense, right?
It does. Yes.
Yeah, because it's not, again, this doesn't have to be something that you pull together the entire class at one moment. It can be. During the relationship skills episode, my friend Lauren, who works in Oregon, she talks about how sometimes she's all ready to give a presentation on color theory, and the middle schoolers she works with are like, no, we really need to talk about this.
So
And
yeah.
she's
Yep.
like, sometimes I have to hit pause and realize that color theory can happen at the end of class or color theory will happen tomorrow. She's like, yeah, there's other times where we have to push forward, but dependent on the students and what's happening in their lives, maybe we need to have a discussion today.
Completely.
Yeah.
Completely. And I think that's why, again, I'm excited and I'm hopeful for a fresh start at the beginning of next year too, to kind of set the temperature, what kind of weather do we want in our classroom, right? And we are very much more so in control of that than we maybe think. Is there's going to be hard stuff, absolutely, but these kinds of conversations and these types of prioritizing how we approach that is going to be really, really important. So I have a couple more things really quick here, Jonathan.
Wait, I
But
wrote
first of all,
down math teacher.
I
Can
did.
address
I was
the
just
math
going to
teacher?
say, before I forget, you have to tell me about math teacher. I'm impressed you remember
Okay.
because usually my brain goes, tell me.
Well, what you don't know, and this is a strategy I've learned to be an active listener, is that when something pops in my head, instead of interrupting, I write down one word on a piece of paper next to me. So that way I don't forget it, because I forget things really easily, but that I don't, then I can move on and listen. So I wrote down math. So
I love that. That's so smart.
well, and I also down here have like summer vacation, staff, right? So that I knew to like, okay, I'm going to come back to that, but to fully listen to you when you're talking, I need to write it down. So helpful hint, everybody, for listening.
I also get it because I'm a big interrupter too, which I kind of just did to you now. So instead of interrupting and having more conversational skills, saying, noted, I'll get back to that.
No, that's part of the rapport we've created, right?
Absolutely.
Is that like we could do that with each other. But okay,
Exactly.
math teacher. So I just brought up Lauren Savigis, who incidentally I traveled across the country with her, taking her to grad school, her eye on a goldfish.
Okay.
Yeah, I think it's a future children's book. But anyway, she brought up that this year, because of the way her school worked, is she really had to support math students in math as well, and her middle school students in art. And she was like, whew. She's like, math teachers, I love you. I appreciate you. I see you. I mean, this is challenging work. And she's like, and I appreciate it. She's like, however, the joy that comes out of, and the social emotional learning that comes out of math is different than and unique from what happens in an art class. She's like, in an art room, we innately talk about like our awareness of things, we put ourselves out onto a page in such a way that we're talking about our emotions and our feelings. And she's like, the joy of getting a math problem correct is different than the joy that comes into creating a piece of artwork. She's like, I'm not saying one is better or worse. She's like, it's different. And her acknowledgement of that I thought was really important, because sometimes in a podcast that's meant for art teachers, like we get like heavy into art education, but it's also, I think, a podcast that's open to anybody to listen to, because there are takeaways for everyone. So
completely.
Math teachers, we love you.
We love you. Honestly, I'm pretty sure my mom's watching, and she's a math teacher in my district, and so she's gonna love that. What's up, excuse? But it's completely true. And there are things like, there's that joy, there's that excitement, those kids that live for math, where like maybe they'll come to the art room and they're like, I don't want to draw, right? But but that's the
Yes.
whole, that's how we know our students. That's how we see those meaningful connections, is recognizing everybody's different and they all have their specialties, just like we do. I don't want to be a math teacher, but that's
That's
why it's special.
Yeah, Catherine Davis Hayes in the very first episode said that she has become cognizantly aware that, like, for some kids, like, we oftentimes talk about the art room being a safe space and we want
Yes.
it to be a safe space. But for some kids, it is stressful
Yeah.
because maybe they don't align with our philosophical version of what a classroom is, right?
Right.
Maybe they're like, oh my gosh, it is challenging for me to use this creative aspect of my brain. But we have to acknowledge that like, yeah, we want to create these spaces that are beautiful and safe and prompt all of these SEL skills. And for some kids, they're going to learn those SEL skills in a much more challenging, difficult way in our rooms.
Completely.
And we have to acknowledge that that's okay, that it's
Oh
okay.
yeah.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, completely. One of the stories, because I know you're a lover of stories, of course, but one of them
Yes.
that really stood out to me at the end of the school year, I had a student who was a fifth grade student and was just trying, like, he was doing this drawing that was a little bit different than I had prompted, and I went over and talked to him. I said, "Oh, tell me about what you're doing. Why did you make these choices?" And we were just trying to go kind of back and forth. And as an art teacher, sometimes you suggest things, and it doesn't mean they have to take the suggestion. But I suggested something to my sweet friend, and he said, "Mrs. K, you always told me that I get to be creative, and I don't think, like, you telling me what to do is part of that creativity." And I was like, you know what? That's true. Now, of course, he was anticipating my suggestion as like a you should do this kind of thing. But
Yeah.
I actually was very humbled and loved that he advocated for himself to say, like, this is the kind of art room that I want, is one where I get to do and express the way I feel creatively, even if it's not exactly the route we're going down. And I said, I always tell my students, I say, if you can just talk to me as an artist, I say, but that just means open-mindedly and
Yep.
in a calm, kind manner, then of course we can talk about that. And that was very humbling and interesting to hear, that like the suggestion rapport is so interpreted differently, in a way where I interpret it as like, hey, Mrs. K is here, suggestion, blah, 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 we're good. But it doesn't always come off that way. So I
Yeah.
was very humbled, and took me back a step a little bit to realize that I need to be careful about that, right? And I need to be understanding about each and every one of those students.
Well, and that's in the relationship skills episode. Pilar
Yes.
Biller is a high school art teacher, and she talks about critique. And she uses the term peer feedback instead of critique, which I really
Yep.
love, actually.
Yep.
And in that episode, she talks about how, like, relationship skills are at their finest
Yes.
within peer feedback, because you're learning how to respond to other people about the work they've created, about, like, and how to do so constructively. And, like,
Yeah.
that is a relationship. Like, and
1,000%. Yes.
yeah, right. And not necessarily relationship like friendships, but like human being interactions. And
Completely.
I was like, again, that was one of those moments where I say out loud, like, I have never thought of that before. Thank
Yeah.
you.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
And especially just not in that way, even, right? Is it's like, there's
Right.
so many things we do, but just that little, like, hey, but have you thought about it in this way? Or have you really considered why you say it in that way to students? Like, could that be damaging? Is it the right way to do it? Or is it maybe just hurtful for certain students? Like, that's what we're talking about, is how do you address each of your students to make that connection so it can feel safe and understanding and loving for any of those students. So
Yeah.
I want to talk so much more about this, but I do
I'm
want
sorry.
to just have us kind of wrap up a little bit with another question that I have. And I also, Jonathan, just wanted to put out there for everyone too, that not only are you hosting the limited run series of the Art of SEL, but you also are a writer for the Art of Education University.
Yeah.
So there are many articles about SEL, about other amazing things you're doing in your classroom and collaborations. So after the chat, I'll be posting some of those in our story too, so people can follow along a little bit more as well. So you're not going anywhere. You're going to be a resource that we get
Yep.
to enjoy for a while. Please don't go anywhere. But I love, I'm just picturing like a black outline drawing of that. Like you're
Yeah.
Mr.
Exactly.
J drawings.
Yes.
Yeah, but don't do that. But I love that at the end. So I'm kind of structuring this chat a little bit like your podcast, because we started with how do you feel right now? But I'm going to end with what do we do with this information? So we've chatted a lot today. Hopefully we've piqued some people's interest to listen to the podcast. Just get into a little bit and sort of reevaluate, how are we teaching? What are we doing right? What do we need to just amp up a little bit? And I'm curious, what can you tell us just advice-wise or excitement-wise? What do we do next?
Yeah. And I end each episode with 3 things, right?
Yep.
So I would say, well, and this is just a given, just listen.
Yeah.
I mean, right? Like, just listen. I have a friend who listens while she walks every morning, and she says it's like having a conversation with me and somebody else.
You're just like at getting coffee, like, ooh, what are they talking about?
Yeah, right?
That's the magic of a podcast.
It's like, eavesdropping, which I guess is kind of what it's like. But yeah, so it is hopefully an enjoyable listen. So take a listen. But I guess 3 things after that. One is like, this doesn't have to be a grandiose, like, all in, you have to throw everything out, start over.
Right.
Not at all. It is looking at the work that you're already doing with students and yourself and your interactions with other people and tweaking them, being more intentional about it, planning for it to happen. There's a lot of SEL that happens just naturally within our spaces because we're humans working with humans.
Yep.
But being intentional about it, planning for these interactions to take place, is important. So that's one. Don't throw everything else out. What you're doing is not wrong, right? Like, just tweaking. Number 2 is like, and I say this in multiple episodes, find a creative accomplice, right? Like, find someone who's excited about this with you. And in your case, like, it could be your mom, right? Math teacher mom, right? Yeah, exactly. It doesn't have to be another art educator. It's great if it is, because then you can talk and share about like lessons and ideas and ways to set up your classroom that like really bring this on. But it can be about like with other people. For me, it's an intervention specialist named Stacy I work with, and my friend Corey, who I actually interview in the Responsible Decision Making. He's an English teacher, right? Like, having people in your life that are your creative accomplices and want to engage in conversation with you. I would love to do it with everybody, with all of you.
Yep.
But we just don't have the time.
I also love that term. Creative accomplice is a beautiful term. Beautiful.
Yeah. Because it can apply to so many things. In this case, it applies to SEL, but it also, I mean, I oftentimes think of my students that way, right? Oh, yeah. Because like, it's like, what are we going to get into today, right? Or let's do this and then ask for permission. No, I'm just kidding, especially if my principal's listening. And then a third thing I think is just spend some time taking care of yourself. Taking
Easier
care of
said than
yourself,
done, but important.
100%. And that's, I read an article for the Art of Ed that was like on the difference between self-care and self-regulation, right?
Very important.
And there is a difference. And self-regulation are strategies that you'll be able to continue over the long term. It's not just about going to get your fingernails done or like staying at an Airbnb. Self-regulation are about these strategies that you are able to use long term, because we need them. We're in a classroom with other people, and our reactions do impact the small or big humans that we are in a classroom with.
Yes.
And so if we're able to kind of check ourselves and find ways to regulate, then we're going to be able to be a more supportive teacher for them as well. So, but you can check out that article.
Yeah, I will link that as well.
But yeah, I think so. Again, like you said, it's so much easier said than done. And, you know, I try not to read comments all the time, but one of the articles that I wrote recently for the Art of Ed was about trees. I teach at a school named Liberty Tree. I grew up in a forest. Trees are what we do, right? But I think someone responded to the article saying like, oh, can't you just let us have our summer? And like, especially this summer. And I was like, well, Yeah, exactly. We want you to have your summer. But in those moments where ideas pop into your mind, right? Like write them down, put them to the side, reflect on them later. But like there are things that pop into our minds as creative people. And like I said with like the list, right, of writing things down, write it down so you can come back to it later. Like that's my newest go-to. So I think I just gave you like 16 things.
That's fine. They're all
okay.
amazing. So I think that's perfect. I was like, tell me one thing. No, it's great. And honestly, when you were talking at the beginning, I did your trick and I wrote down something I wanted to remember in my little thing here. But I love that it's not about revamping your entire year. It's not about one new thing, but I'm picturing it as like putting on your SEL glasses and then everything you see and do is through that SEL lens because it's all we do, right? So if you're going to interact with a kid, just take a step at first and be like, do I got my glasses on? Because if you're ready to interact in that way that we're practicing, right? Trying to be understanding and be kind and be like, we know that kid, then you're going to be likely more successful than reactionary, right? So I'm going to play with that a little bit is those little, look through the SEL lens, right? Through those glasses a little bit. So I think that's going to be helpful too.
And now I'm interrupting.
It's good. You're good.
Today, actually, because all things happen at once, right? So like the empathy episode came out, but then also an article that I wrote on fostering awareness through the use of picture books came out today. And again, the whole idea of just like, yes, I have 2 small kids. We read lots of picture books together. But what if we reframed how we read picture books to like prompt awareness, but like looking at the images, talking about the images. I bring up in the social awareness episode, talking about Mo Willems's Knuffle Bunny and about how Knuffle Bunny is at the laundromat. But then I had this realization this year with kindergartners was like, kids, do you know what a laundromat is?
No.
Nobody did. And I was like, well, it doesn't change the story, but it did offer us like a 5-minute conversation about what a laundromat is, who uses a laundromat, why use a laundromat. Like these are real conversations that are happening, right? So yeah, sometimes it's just about that reframing or, designing things.
Completely is using our SEL learning that we're going to do for ourselves, right? Putting the glasses on. I need some glasses. All right, Jonathan. So give us one more time really quick. And actually, before we do that, I'm going to ask a quick question to my people in the chat here, y'all. So this is to win one of these cool rainbow stickers, which I will mail to you. So if you get the answer right by being the first person to respond in the chat, then I will mail you an amazing rainbow sticker. So I will ask the question, type fast fingers in the chat, and the first response that I see, you'll just need to message the Art of Ed, our Instagram here, just the DM, and I will just your address, and then I will go ahead and send you something. So here's the question. What does SEL stand for? Type away, y'all. What does SEL stand for? You know we love our acronyms in education.
Salty elephant.
Social emotional learning. Art gallery, Mrs. Lucas, I'm giving it to you. I was like, you're gonna get this, Jonathan, right? Oh, thank you all for responding. The first one that I saw was Art Gallery _ Mrs. Lucas. So Mrs. Lucas, if you would go ahead and just DM the Art of Ed, your address, I will go ahead and send you your wonderful stickers. So Jonathan, could you just end us with, again, name of the podcast, where can people listen, where can they follow you, and just learn more to educate ourselves about social emotional learning?
Yeah, so the podcast is The Art of SEL, capital SEL. Learn that. So if you can listen to it anywhere that you listen to your favorite podcast, you can search for it. It's the logo is a bunch of little speech bubbles. And or you can also listen using the Art of Education University's website as well. You can find us there. As well as on there, there's links to different people's Instagram accounts, their Twitter accounts, links to articles that apply to what's happening within the episode. And there's only 8 episodes. So it's not like this huge, it's not a long-term commitment, but it's SEL like is.
Oh, what a tagline. We're not going to, that's the perfect way to end.
That's
I
good,
love it.
Right?
I love it. It's
Yeah.
not a long-term commitment, but SEL is. I couldn't have asked for a better way to end.
Man.
Jonathan, I know you're like, why didn't I say that at the end of my podcast?
So good. Oh, I know. At the end of the podcast, I got emotional because I was like, this is the end. And at the end, I'm just like, thank you. You'll hear it.
But
You'll hear it.
To know how many people you're influencing and that we're all, again, continuing these conversations, the things we're already doing, it is so powerful and so necessary. So thank you for all the work that you've put into this, Jonathan. I know people are already really excited about it, everyone that I've chatted with, and hopefully everyone agrees that hasn't listened yet as well. So like I said,
one last thing.
Yes, please.
Can I add one last thing? Sorry, interrupting. It's just that I feel like this is an important thing to say. This is number 4 takeaway. Nobody is an expert. So like, and that, I think that comes up through every episode, is that the people that I'm interviewing are like, they're still like dumbfounded. There's like, really? You want to talk to me? It's like, yes, I want to talk to you. And then also throughout each one, I am constantly learning new things through each episode. Yes. So I want everyone to know that, like, none of us are experts. We're all learning. So make sure that as you're listening or even having these discussions with your creative accomplice, that like none of us are experts.
Right. I can't stop now just taking notes as you talk, because you just like make the lights go on in my brain. But I just wrote enthusiast, not expert. So we're enthusiastic about learning. So you're an SEL enthusiast.
I will add that to my resume.
Oh my gosh, I have too much fun with you. Everybody, I'm going to be linking a bunch of Jonathan's articles and the podcast in the story after this. And then this chat will also be saved to IGTV. So if anybody wants to watch it or share it with people after, to just kind of get those wheels turning, get excited about learning about how you're going to make your classroom amazing, you will want to just watch it again or share with anybody you want to. So Jonathan, thank you so much for joining us, and everyone have an amazing day.
Thank you.
Bye.